Okay. All right. We are live. So joining me today is a very, very special guest. That's Daniel Stoljar. Daniel, thanks very much for joining me. And I wonder if you would just say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you.
Yeah, I'll be glad to. Thanks for having me, Richard. This is really a fantastic series you're putting together here. So thanks a lot for all your work for the philosophy of consciousness community. So thanks. My name's Daniel Stoljar. I'm a professor of philosophy at the Australian National University in Canberra, which is where I am right now. And I guess I tend to say I work in two broad areas: philosophy of mind, broadly construed, and at the moment, metaphilosophy, broadly construed. So in philosophy of mind, I've been interested in lots of things about kind of mind-body issues, formulations of physicalism, questions about introspection and our access to conscious states. I've been doing some stuff on the language of consciousness, trying to figure out how various of these key phrases and constructions work, like conscious of and what it is like and things like that. And then on the metaphilosophy stuff, I've been interested in, well, it sort of blends into it because some of the positions I like in the philosophy of mind tend to get, I think, misinterpreted, partly because of metaphilosophical issues. But I've been interested in questions about, I'm generally interested in things about, what kinds of questions are philosophical, how they're distinct from other kinds of questions, whether same kinds of epistemological ideas apply in philosophy as apply in other areas, and issues of that sort. So that's roughly what I do.
Very cool. Yeah, a lot of really running the gamut of stuff. But as you say, there's some contact, because when you're discussing issues about physicalism versus dualism or idealism, then the questions about progress tend to come up, because this discussion that we've been having for quite some time.
That's
and
true.
One might wonder whether we can make some progress. And so,
Yeah.
I know that you defend the idea that we do make progress on these questions.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the ideas, I mean, this is a kind of a connection, because in the topic of physicalism, people often say, or at least they seem to assume, I don't know if they exactly say it, but they sort of assume it, or at least seem to assume it, that there's a thing called the thesis of physicalism that,
Right.
Hobbes held, or Smart held, or Lewis held, or something. Democritus held, and we can talk about whether it is true or not. And then there are people who deny it, like C.D. Broad or Descartes or somebody, or Dave Chalmers, at least in some parts of his work. Anyway, but I tend to think that's actually a mistake, and the thesis changes over time, and what it really amounts to changes over time. And that's actually important on the progress issue, because once again, people assume that there's a single thing,
right,
called, the mind-body problem or something. And it's sort of wholly present at each moment that people discuss it, even though maybe the outer clothes are different, the words are different or something.
right.
But the basic underlying problem is the same. And if you think that, then it's very easy to get yourself in a kind of pessimistic mood about progress, because you think, well, we're talking about some problem, it's presumably open, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it.
Right.
If it's literally the same as the problem that was discussed 500 years ago, then that problem has to be open too. So therefore, the whole thing is a history of an open problem.
Yeah.
And
you get quite
it just looks
pessimistic.
terrible. Yeah,
Right.
That's right. But if you think, that's not quite true, they're not really identical, they're actually a range of questions that are related to each other, different from each other, then that sort of image isn't right. It's not the case that there's a single problem that different people have had in mind and have formulated slightly differently. In fact, there are different problems. And I think that's true in the case of physicalism as well.
So one way you could think about this maybe is that, like, take Democritus, who I think of as like the arch physicalist. And I know in your book you you give him the honor of sort of formulating something which we could call physicalism, and it's very clear. It just turns out to be false. That the kind of atomism that he defended. But that's an example of progress as well, on your view, isn't it? Because we falsified that view. So we know, or think we can be reasonably sure, that physicalism, like the kind that Democritus had, isn't something that's true of our world. And that's a kind of progress.
Yeah, that's certainly a kind of progress. I mean, it's not that controversial that philosophy makes progress in that sense. A lot of people say, yeah, okay, we've made progress in the sense that we've established that things are false. Maybe we've established that the version of materialism that Democritus advanced is false. And so that's progress, because that's a kind of progress. And I obviously don't disagree with that. I think that's true. Though people who are usually present themselves as kind of pessimistic about progress in philosophy often accept that point. They say, there's progress in a sense on negative things, but there's nothing positive. Or some other sort of thing. There's something else that is supposed to happen. And I'm more optimistic than that. But for one thing, I think the issue about negative progress is a bit misleading. While it's true, of course, that we've established that things like Democritus' version of materialism is false, that's not the only thing that happens. I mean, a lot of philosophical problems they sort of come in, they sort of have a kind of form of a paradox, roughly speaking. So we've got a bunch of claims which independently are plausible, but together form a contradiction.
Right.
And if you say, well, we need to solve this problem, but we're not allowed to say anything negative, or if we say something negative, that isn't real progress or something, then what you've said is don't solve the problem, because you've obviously got to say something negative if you've got a contradiction like that.
Right.
So while you're absolutely right, that is a kind of progress, that's not a kind of progress that's kind of that controversial. But what is controversial is people often remark that that's a kind of progress, but then say, but that isn't the real thing.
Right.
And that's always a bit puzzling to me.
Yeah, you got to start somewhere by clearing space, at least at the beginning.
Oh, sure. Yes, it can often be extremely important. I don't obviously deny that.
Yeah. So on the sort of stepping back from the question of progress, though, so the thesis I think that you defend in your book is that basically any version of physicalism that's worth a name is false. And then there's these other things, but they're not quite, they don't give you exactly what you want. You go through the different ways of formulating physicalism. So it actually turns out quite difficult to say what the thesis of physicalism is in a way that's, you can't rig up a possible world where you intuitively physicalism is true, but the thesis says that it isn't. But at the same time, you also characterize yourself as a physicalist of some sort in other work of yours. So I wonder, what's your considered view about the status of physicalism? Is it something that we can hold even if we can't define? Or I'm just curious, how these attitudes fit together.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess I think there's kind of, loose and popular physicalism, and then there's strict and philosophical physicalism. So sometimes when you say you're a physicalist, you mean it in a kind of loose and popular sense. And what you really mean is you don't really think that consciousness is a fundamental element of the world. And that's, traditional kinds of dualists obviously think fundamentally. They may not put it this way, but that's a way of characterizing what they believe, that consciousness is a sort of fundamental element of the world. And, non-standard dualists like panpsychists or something, they also think that consciousness is a sort of fundamental element of the world. And if you deny that, that's sort of usually kind of thought of as sufficient to be a physicalist. And in that sense, yeah, I'm a physicalist, because I don't think there's any good reason to think that consciousness is a fundamental element of the world, and that the arguments that people give for that conclusion go wrong in distinctive kind of ways. So that's in that sense, yeah, I'm a physicalist. But you could also mean physicalism in a sort of slightly different sense, where you're really trying to pick up on historical tradition where you have some picture about what the world is like. You have some overall picture about what the world is like in its fundamental elements. And like Democritus that we were talking about before does give you a picture like that. He says, look, there are these fundamental things called atoms. They have these properties. They combine together and create all of the other things that we observe. And that's a kind of that's a different commitment to the one about saying that consciousness isn't fundamental. It's a kind of positive view about the nature of the world. And contemporary physicalists obviously don't believe what Democritus believed, but they often do say that they hold a position which is some sort of, natural extension of that, or the natural heir to what he was trying to get at, or something along those lines.
Right.
And they give some positive account of the world. And in that sense, I very much doubt that any version of that any kind of positive proposal like that, I think, will be subject to the kind of critique I give in my, I guess you're referring to my book about physicalism, not the.
Yeah, sorry, I was.
Progress
Yeah.
book. That's all right. But so there the idea is that any kind of proposal about the nature of the world, which physicalism or materialism traditionally was, is going to be subject to this problem that if you understand it one way, it'll turn out to be false in possible situations where materialism really should not be false.
Mm-hmm.
And if you understand it another way, then it'll turn out to be true in situations in which materialism should definitely not be true. And there's really just no way of getting around this. But that doesn't stop me saying, yeah, as a matter, that's true. But if you ask me, ordinarily, if you're talking in philosophy of mind about whether you're a physicalist or a dualist, that's normally code for, do you think consciousness is fundamental? And I don't, so that's why I'm not.
And so you don't think that that sort of popular way of characterizing physicalism, because I agree with you, I think that's basically, that would be enough to satisfy me as far as physicalism and about the mind goes.
Yeah, sure.
But you don't think that's subject to the kind of worries that you present in the book, that there'll be places.
No, I don't actually. I mean, I don't think it's it's not physicalism if by physicalism you mean a kind of positive theory of the world of the kind that Democritus was giving. It just says, this particular feature, namely consciousness, isn't fundamental. It's derivative, not fundamental.
Right. And you don't think that, but that doesn't give you a kind of, there's not in the background an overarching picture, like there's nothing that consciousness is like on a par with other things that we find on around here. Isn't that an overarching kind of, in the background, isn't there a picture?
There might be. I mean,
like
of course you can hold, but
something like that.
Well, I'm a little worried about naturalism, just like I'm worried about physicalism, and I'll tend to duck and weave if you ask me about naturalism too. Partly because it faces formulation questions of a somewhat similar sort,
right,
that materialism faces, and once again, there's sort of loose and popular naturalism. Where do you mean, do you more or less think that, your approach to the world has to be more or less evidence-based? Yes, of course.
Yeah, that's very
but if you mean some much more specific thing, then I'm liable to get a little bit, much more worried about that. So, I mean, but you might be right that if you what you're saying is that, when people who say, I think that consciousness isn't a fundamental thing, do they have some picture in their heads as to what the world is like? I mean, you're probably right from a psychological point of view. They probably do have some picture, perhaps an inchoate one or something. I'm just pointing out that these are two quite different issues.
Yeah.
And I personally am pretty confident. I'm actually pretty confident that physicalism isn't fundamental. But I actually have no particular view about, I don't have any positive characterization, particularly about what the world is like. How am I supposed to do that?
Yeah. I guess what I was thinking was that the positive characterization is that it's non-mental.
Oh, I see. Well, there are people like there's the so-called via negativa
Right, exactly. So
who
is
say,
it
yeah, so that's right. There are people, Jessica Wilson is one, and I guess Barbara Montero is another, maybe David Papadoe, who hold views like this. Maybe you
right?
too. I don't know, actually. And there's something definitely right about the via negativa. I mean, as I said, often when people say they're materialists, what they fundamentally mean is that consciousness isn't fundamental. And that sounds like saying there's no, that sounds rather like, in fact, what Jessica Wilson says about materialism. But you can also wonder whether you can also take the via negativa as a proposal about what physical properties are, namely they're non-mental. And that, I think, isn't very good if you're looking for an account of an account which captures sort of traditional, historically important materialist worldviews and the ways in which contemporary worldviews of the kind articulated, that became dominant in the 20th century, like Smart's and Lewis's and so on,
Right.
and what they have in common. I mean, they don't just say that everything is non-mental, because they want to rule out other things like, say, vitalism, let's say,
Right.
which isn't mental, but it's not physical. So that's a bit of a problem.
So
And
I mean, so one question I had when I was reading through all this and thinking about this was, early on in your discussion, you say, look, I'm going to set aside this distinction of materialism versus physicalism, sort of. And some people will say, well, we'll use materialism for the historical view and then physicalism for the kind of contemporary view. And you say, well, I don't, that's kind of a rhetorical move you can make, but I don't really see much reason for distinguishing between these two. And I was picking up a little bit on that just now in what you were saying, that basically you're saying there's this thesis, and if you want to identify with the historical lineage here, then we want to be using the words in the way that they were using it, and so we want to find something in common between the two that is continuous. But why not think that there's these two separate views, like the current view, physicalism, which appeals to, has a different set of considerations and worries and so forth, and the historical materialism. And then you wouldn't have that kind of worry that you just were talking about.
That's true. You can define a view and you can say it's called physicalism and it's distinct from materialism. Sure, you can define that view. I mean, actually, the history of those two notions is quite interesting. I mean, physicalism was introduced by the logical positivists,
right?
Who
for phenomenalism
used the word, well, or something close to it anyway. It was something where the physical language is your base language fundamentally. Though, of course, it wasn't clear. At least it's not clear to me when I read Neurath and Carnap and so on, what the physical language is. Is it physics, or is it ordinary languages about rocks and washing machines and things? It's completely unclear to me. And in fact, I think there's some disagreements among them on that sort of view, and maybe there's disagreements over time as well. But in any case, they meant by physicalism the idea that you would take something called a physical language as a base language, and then they would do their positivist thing. And they didn't like the word materialism because that's connected with metaphysics and stuff.
Right.
Which is bad. So that's like the original reason actually for distinguishing those labels. And of course that isn't a good reason now to distinguish them, partly because none of us, well, no, I mean none of us in the generic sense, maybe there are a few of us, but nobody thinks that those distinctions are sort of in place now, that materialism should be rejected because it's a kind of metaphysics, or that we should develop physicalism in this linguistic kind of context. But you're right that you could say, I mean, other people say, yeah, I'm going to use the word physicalism because materialism is associated with this old notion of matter,
right?
Which is present presumably in Democritus and other classical formulations. And we want to abstract away from that, and that's true. So you could talk about physicalism in that sense, and contemporary physicalists do talk that way.
Right.
I mean, I think there's some. I mean, I don't disagree that you can formulate the views in that way. I think it's not quite true to at least to the rhetoric of some of the ways in which these things get discussed. I mean, somebody like, say, Smart and Lewis, certainly, first of all, they were very keen on using the word materialism, not the word physicalism. And secondly, the connection to matter is a bit odd. I mean, if you go back to Descartes and you think, okay, he's supposed to be the arch dualist.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what was he denying? Was he denying materialism? Well, maybe, but whatever he was denying, he didn't think of matter in the way that Democritus thought of matter, because for him, matter was just extension. So he didn't have that. He precisely didn't have that traditional conception of matter that you find in Democritus or Locke or somebody. So so it becomes a bit hard, actually, if you try to say, look, materialism is the thing that uses a particular notion of matter, and I'm going to use the word physicalism for this thing that's some sort of generalization of it. I mean, that's fine, but if you say that they're completely separate, then you're not true to the way in which some of these people have talked, which may or may not be a problem, I suppose. And secondly, some of the historical cases are a bit hard to classify.
Yeah. I guess I was thinking it wouldn't be such a big deal if it came out that Locke wasn't a physicalist, but you could call him a materialist or some other label, and then because it does seem like there are I don't know, but this gets into questions about theory change. Do we want to keep the same terms or not? So I understand the point that you're making, which is that some of these historical cases become hard to adjudicate here, but it just well, let me get off of this and ask you, let me circle back around and ask about the thing, because the kind of physicalism that you want to defend, this idea that the fundamental property or nature of reality is not mental. So already it seems to me the way you present the dialectic here is like you already take it for granted, I think, or not for granted, but you're convinced, let's put it that way, you're convinced by the sort of standard conceivability arguments against traditional versions of physicalism. So you think we need to sort of expand out into things like Russellian monism and things of that nature. So I do wonder why you think, why you're convinced by the conceivability arguments. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you're thinking about that is.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, there's various issues here, I think. There's a kind of toxic mix of philosophical methodology and philosophy of mind and epistemology and various other things.
Dave calls it an unholy stew.
Right, unholy stew, exactly. Well, I'm sort of convinced. I tell you why I'm convinced by the conceivability argument against what I tend to think of as kind of standard or traditional materialism. First, because I do think that there are conceivability arguments that are sound in general. So therefore, I'm not inclined to reject an argument simply because it's a conceivability argument.
Right.
And the example I always give is the conceivability argument against behaviorism, which is Putnam's perfect actor argument.
Right.
It's not often presented as a conceivability argument, but I do think it is basically a conceivability argument. It says it's conceivable that there's some behavioral duplicate of me that's psychologically different. If that's conceivable, then it's possible. And if that's possible, then behaviorism, even in its weakest form, not just behaviorism historically was sometimes presented as a kind of translation, semantic doctrine or something. But even if you think of it in its weakest form that people sometimes call supervenient behaviorism, that argument, I think is a good argument against it. And so and I actually think that, if you ask yourself, how do you teach a philosophy of mind class? You do often give arguments like that when you're explaining why behaviorism is wrong. It's not that that's the only arguments you can give against behaviorism, of course, but that's an argument that I personally accept that argument. And so since that's a conceivability argument, that means I accept at least one conceivability argument.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if somebody, for example, there are people who are kind of skeptical about conceivability reasoning in general. They say, oh, it's ridiculous. It's like, you imagine stuff and then you kind of conclude something about the metaphysical natures of these things. That's completely ridiculous. It's like, mathematics on the basis of toothache or something. It's just ridiculous. But I don't think that's right, because that's what I just gave you is a conceivability argument, which I take to be sound. And so therefore there's at least one which is a good one. Now, having said that, I do think there's loads and loads of open questions about what the nature of conceivability reasoning is. So Chalmers has got one particular view about what that is. Other people, like Steve Yablo, have got completely different views about what that sort of reasoning amounts to and how best to give an account of it. And I don't have a particular view about that. The crucial point for me is that however, whatever the story is, it's got to have the result that this argument against behaviorism is a good argument. And so far as I can tell, it's a conceivability argument. So there you go. Now,
can I just stop for I know before you go on, can I just ask one quick question? So would you feel that way if it was the only argument against behaviorism? Because I mean, you mentioned there are other ones, and like I'm thinking like the Chomsky style arguments and these other ones that just appeal to, kind of competence and what's intuitively how much data we get exposed to. So if those weren't there and there were no other arguments against behaviorism, you think this conceivability argument would be enough to convince us that it's false?
Well, I mean, that of course depends on other sorts of issues. I mean, if God appears and told us that behaviorism is true, well then no, I would say no. That means that there's got to be something wrong with this argument. So it's true. There's one can kind of describe an epistemic situation in which, if that were the only argument, that may not be sufficient. Though I could also imagine a situation in which that would be sufficient. Usually the arguments come in packs, so that if you've got a good argument about something you can usually find some other sort of argument as well that's problematic.
I guess the reason I'm thinking of this, though, is because in the physicalism case, it seems like the only kind of arguments that you have are conceivability arguments. So it seems somewhat different than the behaviorism case.
Well, I don't think that's true. Let's take the Cartesian version of materialism that I mentioned before, where he thinks that matter is just extension. Okay, so if you can formulate a version of materialism in terms of that notion, it would be everything is a function of extension, or everything is grounded in extension or something.
Right.
Everything supervenes on extension. That would be the kind of materialism. I mean, he of course didn't put it that way, but that's roughly the kind of materialism that he was rejecting. Now, you could give a conceivability argument against that. I can imagine somebody that's identical to me in respect of all properties that just have to do with extension in space, and yet who has some different psychological feature from me. That looks like a pretty good argument, and it looks about as good as the argument against behaviorism, it seems to me. Okay, so that's a good argument. Is it the only argument against that kind of materialism? No, we also have empirical arguments to the effect that, and we have empirical arguments that the physics that makes it plausible that matter is extension isn't a terribly good physical theory.
Right.
So that's a good argument against that kind of materialism. Another argument is just the intuitive argument that's got nothing to do with physics. It's just, don't we have a notion of matter according to which it's more than just extension in space? That's also an argument against that kind of view, and those are all. It's not like we only. So that's a version of that's a historically important version of materialism. It's not the one that people these days discuss, of course.
Right.
But just as Descartes is a historically important version of dualism, well, then presumably the kind of materialism he was opposing has to be historically important too.
Right.
And that version looks as if we've got arguments against it which are of a materialist kind, and we've got of a conceivability kind, and we've got other arguments too. And I think that's roughly the case. I actually think the same is true in the contemporary setting as well. So if you think I think people don't, in the case of somebody like Dave Chalmers, who defends obviously the conceivability argument, people don't focus enough, I think, on what he means by the physical exactly.
Yeah.
And it turns out that when you look at that question in detail, and you go through his work on sort of structuralism and so forth, which is extremely closely connected to this.
Right.
He means something remarkably abstemious by the physical. He means something that can be definable in just using two buckets of vocabulary, the logical and mathematical bucket and the causal and gnomic bucket. And by the way, in the causal and gnomic bucket, all you have are expressions like causes, it is a law that, maybe disposes, things like that. And so then physicalism is something that supervenes on, everything supervenes on a bunch of truths which are formulable in that limited vocabulary.
Right.
And that seems to me to be a rather implausible view, independently of conceivability reasoning about consciousness. The idea that absolutely everything is a function of truths formulable in that limited vocabulary. The wonder isn't so much that you can't extract consciousness from that. The wonder is that you could extract anything at all from that apart from
because it's all structural.
It's structural in a specific sense of structure.
It's very specific sense. So is this because you think it leaves out the intrinsic properties, or do you think that even if you don't go into the debate about intrinsic properties, there's still something implausible about this formulation?
Well, just take an ordinary physical statement, like that there's a desk in the room. Well, that's got to be made true by some fact that has the form. There is an A and there is an X and there is a Y, and X has logical property blah blah and stands in logical relation to Y and causes Y, and there's a law that covers X and Y. That's all you've got. Right. And those things have to add up, have to somehow ground the fact that there's a desk in the room.
And you find that apply, because that doesn't seem that impossible to me.
Well, you don't think so? I mean, how do you get just the ordinary physical nature of the world? I mean, this is go ahead. No, you go ahead. Well, I mean, one could have a debate about that. I can see that, I suppose, but I guess from my own point of view, I find that really quite implausible. And as I said, it wouldn't be surprising that you couldn't get consciousness out of that. Because you don't think you get tables and chairs out of that. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure actually that Dave himself thinks you can get tables and chairs out of that, because remember he thinks that phenomenal expressions are also in the base. So, and you need them to get other things apart from these merely topic neutral accounts. So yeah. I mean, I read your paper on the Chalmers v. Chalmers. I think that's connected to some of the things we're talking about right now. It is, yeah. Mm-hmm. So because the way he defines structuralism about spaces in terms of the kinds of experiences that a certain thing will cause, you think that there are that this is a way of diffusing part of the argument in a way that makes it problematic for him to hold the conceivability arguments, because
here seems to be an example of some structural truths that entail a phenomenal truth, namely the kind of experience of space or left or right or something like that. Is that basically the way of putting the problem?
Yeah, the problem in that paper is roughly that if you build experiences into your definition of the physical via your definition of space-time, then it becomes rather difficult to see how you can advance a conceivability argument.
Right.
Because the conceivability argument is supposed to be that you can imagine a world that's physically the same as this one, but lacks experiences. But if experiences are built into the definition of what the physical is, it becomes harder to make that point. Now, there are ways of making that point, but just so by itself, that what I just said doesn't put that much pressure on his position. But what I tried to do is to argue that the obvious ways of blocking that don't work. But so that's the issue there. But in the background is this issue about how a kind of dualist position of the kind that Dave is interested in developing, what it presupposes about the notion of the physical.
Right. What did you make of his response to that? Which was, I mean, I'm getting this a little bit of a sidetrack from our original. I'll come back to that in a second, but I am curious about what your response to his response was, which basically was to kind of take a move from your playbook and use it against you, I think, because he was like, well, I could distinguish two notions of physical predicate here, or property. So one is this kind of ordinary one, and one is this kind of theoretical one. And in the ordinary one, there's a gap for, and the theoretical one, there isn't, which basically is what I take his response to this argument to be. Is, have you seen it, or what do you think?
I have seen it. Yes, I'm a bit, I'm not quite sure I have sort of formulated a view about how to respond to it. I mean, it sounds to me as if what he wants to say is that there's some sort of technical notion of the physical according to which it really is just equivalent to these topic neutral notions.
Right.
And then, okay, so but that fundamentally means, since he's formulating his physicalism, the kind of thing he's rejecting in terms of that notion, then he is then he's saying, well, what I have proved with my conceivability argument is that a picture of the world according to which everything is a function of logic and mathematics on the one hand, and just enriched with it is a law that and causes on the other. That's all it is.
Right.
That's false, and you've got to add consciousness. Okay, I kind of agree with him that it's false, but not simply for the consciousness.
Not simply for the consciousness part. Yeah. So because I think this is kind of gets to something I wanted to ask you about as well, about the nature of the conceivability arguments, because like for someone like me, who I consider myself friendly to physicalism. I don't know if I think it's true, but certainly, I guess my considered opinion is I don't think it's been refuted by conceivability arguments. And the reason why I think that is because I think there are conceivability arguments on the other side for physicalism or against property dualism and these things. And so one of these are what I called Chamby's, and Keith Frankish has a related notion. So does Scott Sturgeon. So you see this, and so does Kari Balog, actually. So you see this idea pop up every now and again. But basically, the idea is that, so it seems to me at least that you could take the base that Chalmers talks about, that Dave talks about, say, okay, if that's what you mean by the physical, is it conceivable that there's a possible world where just that is instantiated and yet there's also consciousness? It seems conceivable to me. Right. I don't see a contradiction in it. I don't think, if there were one, I think someone would have pointed out at least a general area where it might be, and no one's done that yet. So it seems perfectly conceivable to me that there be this kind of Chalmers world that's totally just physical, has a totality clause, whatever you like, but yet also has consciousness. So you think that's inconceivable?
Well, I think those arguments are super interesting. I don't have a kind of worked out view about exactly what's going on with those arguments, but I think here's a test for a position like the one you just described. Okay. Take a conceivability argument that kind of isn't controversial, like the one I mentioned about behaviorism, or the one I mentioned about materialism formulated with Descartes' physics.
Right.
They're sort of helpful kind of laboratories because we're sort of unencumbered by this issue about, oh my God, what happens if physicalism is false or something?
Yeah, because we already think that's false.
We already think these things are false. And moreover, as I mentioned, we think they're false because of conceivability reasoning. Okay, so now we could ask, well, does the kind of move that you just mentioned work there too? So suppose I said to you, look, it's conceivable that there's someone the same as me in respect of all matters of Cartesian extension, and yet doesn't feel as I do. Now, okay, so then you go through it and then you refute materialism formulated in that way using a conceivability reasoning. Well, the kind of line that you're imagining would be, but I can also conceive positively that just this extension, just this fact about extension, is identical to some fact about consciousness. And then you proceed, and then you say, aha, now I have this kind of meta problem that I've got one line of argument going for one conclusion, and I have another kind of line of argument going for the other conclusion, and you get the feeling that there must be something wrong with conceivability reasoning because it can get us into this pickle.
Right.
But I guess in that case,
but it's not. That's not exactly
while it's perfectly true that you can. No, maybe not. But I guess I'm trying to make the point that if you take an argument like that, which is a conceivability argument, which we accept, and then you construct this alternative shadow argument, which doesn't say I can imagine extension in the absence of consciousness, but says I can imagine extension being identical with consciousness. If you say that, and then you go on, but I guess I'm not so sure that you can. You can certainly formulate it in words, but whether you the first premise is true isn't very plausible. I guess that's the point I'm working up to.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that exactly what Locke did, though, in a way? I mean, Locke is very. I mean, if you just look at the historical record, I think that's one way of looking at what Locke's point was that look, we have no. It's conceivable that consciousness and matter go together. It's conceivable that they don't go together. God could have super added it. He might not have. So that the even given their notions of what material or physicalism was, it was still an open question. And certainly, someone like Hobbes, I think, Hobbes was. That's exactly what he was. What he thought was the case was that it was just extension motions in the brain or whatever. That's what the mind or consciousness was. I think he thought it was conceivable that was true, and he didn't think there's a contradiction there. So I guess my point is not that conceivability arguments are bad. My point is that you only know which one is the good one after the fact, and that's why in this case I think we already know which one is the good one. We can say, well, this conceivability arguments against Descartes is pretty convincing because we sort of have antecedent knowledge that it worked out a certain way. But if we were in Locke's position, we wouldn't know, or Hobbes's position, we wouldn't know which one. I mean, I think Hobbes would be perfectly within his rights to sort of respond in this way, given the way Descartes argues. And at that point in time, they wouldn't have known which conceivability argument was really the good one, because guys sort of accept the idea that, I like conceivability arguments generally. But so if you think zombies are conceivable, then dualism, then physicalism of a certain sort is falsified. But if you think that things I call shambies or the physical duplicates are conceivable, then dualism is the falsified thing. At this point, can conceivability arguments by themselves tell us which is which? That's what I'm kind of questioning. Not that they're bad, but that they don't point in a direction until after you already know for other reasons what one view is suspicious or.
Yeah, I see. So it's not just that they should be rejected entirely, but they're sort of bad in a sense, though, because they don't tell us in advance. They don't tell us they can't sort of settle some question.
That's the kind of point that I'm.
Yeah, I see. I mean, on the Hobbes Descartes thing, I mean, one thing that's a bit puzzling is, of course, they had different views about the physical because Hobbes was an atomist,
right?
Descartes wasn't. So once you are kind of super critical about what Leopold Stubenberg calls the South Pole of the mind-body problem, the body bit. Once you become, hypercritical about that, you begin to worry that the Hobbes-Descartes thing issue isn't really joined anyway. And it could be that that's what's going on when, if you don't know what the physical is, then there's a sense in which you could perhaps imagine that consciousness was just the physical, or that God could super add it. But in the case of Descartes' notion of extension, he there's nothing to learn about the physical. He knows exactly what it is.
Right.
And so if you fix the notion of the physical in that sense, and you understand it in the way that Descartes had in mind, then it looks as if you can't construct these pairs of conceivability arguments about that. And I actually think something is true similarly in the Chalmers setup, because in the Chalmers setup, the notion of the physical is almost Cartesian in the sense that it's so thin that we know perfectly well what it is.
Right.
And so it's harder to then construct these. I hadn't thought really about this, so it's an interesting question, but I think it'd be harder to construct the zombie, what was it, Schmombies or?
Shambi.
Shombies, yeah, right. Anyway, these two, these sort of arguments which kind of shadow each other. And so then you wouldn't get the conclusion which you're aiming at, which is that not so much, as you said, not so much that conceivability arguments are bad, but certainly that there's some pretty big limitation on how they can be used.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I just don't see because just taking the kind of Chalmers base for granted, if it gives a complete account, if you can get from there via some necessitation or scrutability thesis or whatever, however, you want to flesh the picture out. If you can get from those limited base facts to claims about tables and chairs, then I think you can also get the claims about brains. And if you can do that, then you can get the consciousness. So I guess the main issue is whether you can get the tables and chairs, because that's where you're already skeptical. But I don't know. It seems conceivable to me that you could do that in principle. So
there's also an issue. There's an issue here about what the word conceivable means.
Yeah, negative conceivability. Right.
Yeah. So I tend to actually think that negative conceivability isn't a terribly good guide to possibility anyway.
Okay.
And it's really imaginability that matters. So that in the Putnam case, for example, it's not simply that you can't see a contradiction in it, or that you can't a priori deduce that somebody's in pain from information about their behavior. It's that you can imagine a case in which someone behaves just as you do and yet doesn't feel as you do.
Right.
That seems to me the strongest version of these arguments. That's the one which seems to me to have most force.
Yeah, so when Dave talks about this stuff, he says all he needs is negative conceivability for the.
He does, yeah.
So that's why I was focusing on that. But
though, of course, he means by negative conceivability, he means you can't rule it out on ideal rational reflection.
Right.
And yeah, so.
After the fact,
like a lot of people, I tend to get worried about what ideal. How many facts are. It's a bit like the Kripke thing about, stuffing your brain full of facts. How many facts do you have to stuff your brain full to get to this amazing ideal state?
Yeah, exactly. That's obviously a problem. But
whereas imaginability isn't like that. It just, you can imagine a case. That's it.
Yeah. So, I still think it's imaginable. Maybe we can get off this at this point, but I still think that I can imagine, that we have a brain that functions in the way that I do, and then there's consciousness with no non-physical properties. That seems imaginable to me. Okay. But so I've never found the idea that it's so hard to it's hard to understand. Like, I get that. Like, if you just sort of stipulate how could it be? I get those kind of worries. Like, how could it be the case that, this experience is the brain state? But that doesn't, so that seems to me a request for explanation, but
Mhm.
You know, maybe we can't explain it, but it doesn't seem to me that that means we can't conceive of it or imagine it. We just can imagine something that we don't know how it got to be that way. Seems to be something we can do. We can imagine, you know, are
Mhm.
there unanswerable questions? Yeah, I think I can picture that, even if I can't picture what the question is.
Mhm.
But you don't think, I mean, so that's why I was asking at the beginning about sort of classical materialism and the conceivability arguments, because it seems like you say, yes, I accept that these arguments are good enough to set aside sort of traditional physicalism and we should expand our notions here.
Mhm.
And so that's why I brought all this up, because to me, I want to balk at that step already. I don't want to say
Mhm.
conceivability arguments are bad. I wonder why, given that we have this, that no one has shown what's wrong with the other side of the picture, and given that all there are conceivability arguments, why we should sort of be pushed in one direction as opposed to sort of remaining
Well,
neutral.
as I say, I don't. It depends what version of physicalism you're discussing, but mostly I think it isn't true actually. That I mean, there's two issues here. I think one is this: what to say about the zombie issue, and I agree that's a difficult one. There's another issue though about whether conceivability reasoning is the only kind of reasoning we have available to us to kind of attack materialism. And I think that does depend a lot on what materialism really amounts to.
Right.
And so, I mean, as I mentioned, the Cartesian version of materialism, that isn't true. The kind of version of materialism that Dave is trying to formulate, I don't think that's true either. I think there are other arguments against that. Take the version of materialism that people like Lewis and Smart adopted, which is different again from the other two that I mentioned,
Right.
because they basically said, oh, what we're going to do is take contemporary physics, as Lewis says at one point, perhaps somewhat improved,
Yeah.
and treat that as a kind of a full story about nature. And I guess that seems like a completely remarkable thing for anybody to believe, regardless of consciousness.
Yeah.
And so I think once you kind of really focus on what materialism is, the idea that conceivability arguments based on consciousness could refute it isn't that striking.
Right. They seem
Because
irrefutable by other things that are less ambitious.
Well, they just seem, yeah. I mean, unless you really idealize and you say, okay, I really mean the full physics of the world, whatever that is. Okay, but then we know that there are problems with that too. Not so much because I don't think it's that plausible. You got a conceivability argument against that, because conceivability arguments have these epistemic requirements. You have to kind of really understand what you're talking about when you're talking about worlds that are physically the same. And if you have a kind of whatever it takes account, then you can't formulate such an argument. So
exactly.
So I tend to think that if you actually formulate what physicalism is in the way that people like Dave have done, or Descartes did, or that Smart or Lewis did, then each of those positions, I tend to think they can be. I think that conceivability arguments involving consciousness refute them, or at least put them under a lot of pressure. I agree there's lots of questions like the ones you've raised.
But so you could refute them with conceivability arguments about tables and chairs, right? Or is that something you couldn't do? So on the way you're setting it up, it's like, okay, so we could imagine a Chalmers world that has all the physical base there that he specifies, but no tables.
Well, you could certainly, I mean, it depends on the kind of argument. I mean, yeah, if all you know about the world, I tend to put this not so much in terms of conceivability reasoning, but in terms of knowledge argument style reasoning.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Maybe that's a questionable.
No, I see a connection, because they're both about a priori deducibility.
I mean, if you sort of say, okay, you tell me about a possible world and you describe it completely to me, and the sentences that you use, the only non-logical vocabulary in those sentences are causes and it is a law that, and everything else is logic. Okay, just to make it explicit.
Yeah.
You tell me. So basically you're saying there is an X and there is a Y, and X causes Y. Oh, and there's There's a Z, and Z does something else. And that's all you got, okay? That's
it.
what you told me about the world. Now I have, okay, now, is there a desk in that world? You ask me. But what am I supposed to say? The only answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that's a knowledge argument that I just gave you, because it says, right, okay, I have in a certain description of if materialism were true in the form that he has in mind there, then yeah, you should be able to work out a priori whether or not there's a table in that.
So you don't buy the cosmoscope kind of argument? Because that's, I mean, so you need a computer in there, obviously, because it'd be too much for a person. But if you had a giant computer that could read that sentence and then render like a virtual environment for you, that doesn't seem conceivable. I mean, that seems conceivable.
Well, you need to be careful. I mean, I think the exact vocabulary of the base language in Dave's book on this and his discussion, he goes through different proposals as to what the base language can be. I'm now talking about an extremely abstemious version of the base language. Now, it could be that there's some much less abstemious version of the base language, according to which a cosmoscope might do it. And the only problems with it, we just don't have enough memory power or computing power to do this. But we could,
in fact, fill out the base.
Yeah, but what I'm convinced of is I don't care whether you're Laplace's demon. If all you know about the world, the possible world that we're describing, is exactly what is you give me a description of that world in that limited vocabulary, and then you ask me, is there a table or chair in that world? I mean, it's.
I see what you're saying. Yes,
I'm sort of that sort of little sound. Is
it's not the incredulous stare. It's the bewildered grunt. It's like, what do you do with all of this information, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe he doesn't really mean it in that abstemious a way, and that's fine. Maybe he doesn't, and as I said, he certainly discusses other possibilities,
right?
And so, of course, even Dave, by the way, agrees that if you just restricted it to logic and mathematics, what I'm saying is absolutely true,
right?
Because that's like the Newman problem, basically.
Right.
The Newman problem is it's not the same exactly, but it's a very closely related point to the Newman point, which is that if you just limit yourself to logical and mathematical notions, then you just haven't said anything about the world. Any world at all that's big enough fundamentally will make what you're saying true.
Right.
And
well,
so
you need like
likewise,
indexical facts at least.
Yeah, you may be needing indexical facts, but in here what we're talking about is enriching it to
include phenomenal.
Well, if you include phenomenal, that's different. What I'm talking about at the moment is just taking something like logical and beginning with the kind of Russellian picture where you've just got logic and mathematics. Right. And then you add a few expressions like causes and it is a law of that. By the way, they, as far as I know, they were already included in Russell's base because he thought of them as kind of logical, because he thought of causes. I don't know. I'm not actually a good enough scholar of Russell to know this, but what I suspect is that he thought of them as something, basically because they're connected to conditionals and generalizations and so forth. That the notion of cause isn't sort of an extra thing anyway.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Of course, we don't think of cause in that. We think of it as an extra thing. But
I mean, I guess if you, so there's a kind of, I mean, I don't want to belabor this point because I understand what you're saying, and I like the healthy dose of skepticism. But I guess the kind of hand wavy idea is, well, look, we have a picture in physics right now, like the standard model, where if you sort of model it as like a giant quantum field theory and maybe some string theory thrown in there behind, well, then you can sort of wave your hands and say, oh yeah, and then there's decoherence will sort of defuzzy the picture for us. And so you can kind of see a path from the completely abstract physical model we have to answering a question about whether there's a table or a chair. it would be, boiled down to the question whether a certain mathematical question about T-coherence and a bunch of superpositions and blah, 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 that'd be very complicated. But granted, that's hand wavy, but I mean, there's a conceivable path where that comes out to be, where that could be done.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a conceivable path, meaning there's a series of inferences that one might make.
Yeah.
But it isn't, the issue isn't so much whether it would be, if you told me that the world has this structural description, in other words, a description just in this limited vocabulary, it would be a good inference to assume that it has a table, that there's a table in the world. Well, maybe, but that's a separate matter, because the kind of positions we're talking about mean that it's not just that it's a good inference, it's something that you can work out a priori.
It's necessitated, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying.
All you need to be skeptical about it is to just feel that it wouldn't be so clear that it would still be an open question, even for a Laplace's demon, or a kind of Mary, or a sort of, in other words, an idealized rational agent who is acquainted with this thing, whether they could then figure out that there was a table.
So what, on your view, then, do we have to add to this kind of austere base in order to make the picture plausible?
Well, I mean, I think you've got to add. No, I mean, there's got to be loads of non-logical vocabulary. What exactly it is, I don't know. It might be lots of things in physics. You might need sort of mass and charge and so on, and maybe you need, maybe you need things like wood, and maybe you need things like legs and things like that. Legs of a table, I mean.
Yeah, no, I got it.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I don't know. I don't know what you have to add. I just think that isn't enough. That's all.
And then ultimately, also, it's got to be whatever you add is not mental, and then that preserves physicalism. So if you add things like legs and tabletop, that's okay, as long as. Well,
if you worried at the moment, I'm not. If we're thinking about, at the moment, notice that what we're doing is formulating a kind of physicalism and asking whether the existence of tables refutes it.
Right.
So,
yeah,
okay,
that's what we're doing.
So we haven't even got to consciousness or anything.
Right, exactly. But
so you should change you should change the name of the show to Tables Live.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, well noted. Tables Live coming soon. Yeah, but I mean, ultimately, though, to keep that bigger picture in mind, though, that's what you're saying, is that so you may need to expand it to give it a fighting chance of being realistic. But as long as you don't include things in that are mental, so as long as the base doesn't include phenomenal truths or facts or properties, then you can still preserve something that we would call physicalism and that you would want to defend.
Yes, and also you're going to include. I mean, if you mean. What I would think is you've got to include the fundamental facts of the world, whatever they are. Tables, I'm pretty sure
they're not fundamental.
Tables are not fundamental. Okay, tables are derivative objects. Now, that means that there's some arrangement of the fundamental elements of the world, whatever they are, that kind of add up to tables. So you've got to add that, whatever that is. Now, I don't know what that is. If you ask me, what is that? You've in effect asked me to tell you what, according to me, are the fundamental elements of the world.
Yeah.
And I'm here to tell you that I am not here to tell you that. How could I possibly tell you that? I mean, it's kind of amazing that people in philosophy of mind think that it's somehow their professional business to say what the fundamental elements of the world are. That's a kind of extraordinary fact.
It is. It's true.
And I personally am not going to do it.
You're standing up, like taking the hard stance here. But actually, that brings me, because there is one answer that people typically give to that, and that's the idea of revelation. which is, I know that this isn't something that I read in a paper of yours, but I saw your lecture on this for the Moscow thing I was telling you about. But anyway, so this is something like Philip Goff defends, that we can know the sort of intrinsic nature or something like that, close to it, based on introspection. And you think that doesn't work. So while you want to defend the traditional conceivability arguments, you don't think they really are going to succeed in terms of when recast in terms of revelation. And that's part of why.
Somebody like Phil. Somebody like Philip. I mean, he's not alone actually, but he's a kind of forceful on this point. I mean, he thinks that, first of all, that revelation is true. So what is revelation? It's something like, if you have an experience, then you're in a position to know its essence or something. He also thinks that that's somehow presupposed in conceivability reasoning. And so I think that isn't true, that I don't think that revelation is true. And I don't think it's presupposed in conceivability reasoning. Someone like David Lewis actually held a view that's kind of interestingly related to that. He didn't think it was true, but he did think it was, as he says, built into folk psychology, which means somehow if you do the sort of psychology of human beings properly, it'll turn out that we all agree to revelation.
I mean, he gave the most amazing reason for that too, which is that philosophers think it's obvious, which is
only Kripke thinks it's obvious.
Yeah, right. Only one philosopher, exactly. Kripke thinks it's obvious.
I mean, a very, very good philosopher, but
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's. No,
you would think you need a little bit more of an evidence base for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Those are the days.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It was a simpler time back then.
Oh,
no
my
coronavirus.
God. Marvelous. Yes. So he and I guess I try to argue against that by saying, I mean, there's a lot of technical issues about what counts as knowing the essence of a thing.
Right.
But I tend to understand it as there's something which is like the totality of the essential properties of a thing. And then so that if you had an experience, then you would know, or at least you'd be in a position to know, the totality of its essential properties. So that's what revelation entails, as I understand it.
Right.
And then to argue against that, all you really need to do is to point out that, there can be an essential property of an experience, which is such that if you had the experience, you'd still be in the dark as to whether the experience had that property. And one way to do that is to just think about theories. There are different theories about what experiences are. But one of them might be right. In those lectures that you're referring to, I sort of took as an illustration, the sense datum theory. Not that the sense datum theory is true, but it's just like well known as a theory. So you sort of say, well, suppose it were true that when you had an experience of a red thing, you were in fact acquainted with a red sense datum. Okay, suppose that were true. Well, that's clearly got to be an essential feature of the experience,
right?
If it's true. It'd be pretty weird for a sense datum theorist to say, oh no, that's just a contingent accompaniment or something. No, the whole point is that what they're trying to do is to say what the structure of the experience is, what it is in its inner nature. That's what they're trying to do.
Right.
And of course, many of us disagree with that. But anyway, it's just worth having it as a kind of cartoonish theory. Okay, suppose just for the sake of argument, that was true. That when I did have an experience of a blue thing, I was acquainted with a blue sense datum.
Right.
Well, what revelation says is that you could know the sense datum theory because you could know that your experience had that structure simply by having the experience. And I would have thought that even the sense datum theorist doesn't agree with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Sense datum theorist thinks you've got to work your way through G.E. Moore's lectures on perception or something,
Yeah.
or work your way through the argument from hallucination or whatever it is, or I don't know, Frank Jackson's book from the 1970s about the structure of perceptual reports and how you can't account for that structure unless you believe the sense datum theory. You've got to have some big argument, in other words,
Exactly,
for the sense datum theory. You can't just see a blue thing or have an experience of a blue thing. And
exactly.
that's why that's why it just doesn't seem plausible to me at all.
The idea of revelation, because basically the idea is that if revelation were true, then we would be able to tell by introspection that sense datum theory was or was not true. But that's something like, absurd or something, or not absurd, but I mean, highly not intuitively the case at all. So we should reject revelation.
Yeah.
So I like this idea. One question I have is whether you can give a restricted definition and still keep something of it. So I imagine, So I imagine someone like Philip kind of responding by saying, "Look, well, revelation is a thesis about the experiential character of the state in question, so that what gets revealed to you is like the what it's like part."
Exactly. No, he does. He does say that.
Right. And so maybe not these other features, but that's enough to ground an argument against materialism, I guess.
Yeah, that's what he says. I mean, for example, as I said, let's suppose that the essence of a thing is the totality of its essential properties.
Right.
Well, you can see immediately that you've got the notion of the partial essence, which is just some of the essential properties, not the totality of the essential properties.
Right.
And maybe what's true is that when you have an experience, you know some of the essential properties of the experience, but not all. And so, for example, when you have the experience, suppose again that the sense datum theory is true, and when you have it, when you perceive a blue thing, you're actually related to some blue sense datum. Okay, so maybe when you have the experience, you don't know that essential property, but you may know some other essential property, and that might be sufficient. The problem is that by itself doesn't put any pressure on materialism, because the materialist can say, it's exactly like the materialist says, actually, the inner structure of this thing isn't as the sense datum theorist says. It's having some brain state or something.
Right.
And that's the essential nature. That would be a thing that a certain kind of materialist might say. And they might say, that's the essential feature of it that you can't know, but you can know this other thing that it feels a certain way. Materialists don't deny that experiences feel a certain way.
Right. Exactly.
So they, or if they did, then we wouldn't need to be having the discussion we've just been having.
Right. Exactly.
It would be obvious that their views are wrong. So they don't deny that. So that the thing is that so in other words, there's this notion of partial revelation, which is not defined in terms of all of the essential properties, but simply some of them.
Right.
That there is a notion like that, and Philip discusses it. The thing about partial the first thing to say about partial revelation is that it just doesn't have any of the philosophical consequences that full revelation does.
Right.
So it isn't actually a terribly interesting thesis. It doesn't. You could still discuss whether it's true, of course, and somebody might think even that isn't true. I mean, a skeptic about essential properties, for example, might even reject it. But regardless of whether it's true or false, it doesn't, on the face of it, have the same sort of consequences. What Philip does is he thinks there's a kind of a bridge from partial revelation to full revelation. Right,
about a specific sub-feature.
Yeah, exactly. So he seems to think that suppose partial revelation was true of something, so that, or of an experience. So when you had the experience, you knew some of the essential properties of the experience, but not all. What Philip thinks is that the properties which constitute that partial essence, the ones that you know in virtue of having the experience, full revelation has to be true of those properties.
Right.
So, as it were, it's sort of like if partial revelation is true of something, then full revelation is true of some nearby thing. That's the basic move, right?
Right.
And that doesn't seem to me to be very plausible, because it's sort of like saying, oh, if suppose I know of human beings that they have a certain essential property, like they're rational, I suppose. I mean, actually, that given recent history, you might worry that is not, in fact, an essential property of human beings. But let's go back again to the good old days when that was an essential property of human beings, right?
Cool, yeah.
The sort of position that Philip, I think, is trying to advance would have the following consequence, that if you knew, so that's roughly like partial revelation with respect to being human. That is, you know some of the essential properties. You don't know other essential properties. Right. Like maybe maybe there's something about the necessity of origin or something that you don't know about. But that's an essential property of human beings. So you know this thing, that they're rational, but not other things. So partial revelation is true in the sense that you know some of the essential properties of humans, but not all. Okay. What Philip then thinks is that, that means that something like full revelation, or you have to be completely cognizant of all of the essential properties of rationality if you know that humans are rational. Right. And that's just not true, because you can know or believe that humans are rational and still think there's lots of essential properties of rationality
that we don't know.
That we don't know. I mean,
so is that because being rational is not a phenomenal? I mean, so if you just do it for phenomenal properties, do you still get that same worry?
Well, let's suppose I said, okay, suppose I'm in pain, and partial revelation is true of pain. So therefore I know some of the essential features of pain, but not all. Right. What's the essential feature of pain that I know, which what's the essential feature of pain that I know? Well, perhaps the essential feature is it's a kind of a feeling. It's a kind of feeling. Right. So I know that it's a kind of feeling. So now take the notion of feeling, or kind of feeling, let's say. What Philip thinks, I think, is that full revelation must be true of that. You must know all of the essential properties of a feeling, but that isn't the case. In fact, we could use the same point, because we could say, well, if you're the sense datum theorist, then you think feelings consist in, being acquainted with the sense datum too. It's just that the difference between pains and color sensations has to do with what sense datum you're acquainted with. Right. But you might. Yeah,
but I guess, see, that's not limited enough, because I mean, I don't want to defend revelation, because I don't believe that is true either. But still, I wonder, so isn't the thesis that what's revealed is the phenomenal nature, like the experiential thing?
Well, but
what it's like for you to have it. That's what he thinks is. So the way I read his argument is, look, when I have a pain, I know what it's like to have a pain. And I can tell from what it's like to have the pain that it's not a physical thing, that it's not like having a C fiber firing. So therefore they're distinct. I mean, that's roughly the way his argument works, right? And I'm not sure if these kind of objections really get at that, or maybe they do and I'm missing it. Sorry.
I think the argument works by saying that when you have an experience, you know the full essence of the experience. But you don't suppose that materialism were true. Then of course it would have some physical essence, and you don't know that. So therefore it can't have a physical essence. That's the structure.
But see, but the only reason I'm balking at this is because, I mean, I know that people like Philip, they accept, he's a panpsychist, and so you can have different versions of it, like constitutive or reductive or non-reductive, and so forth. You have all these different versions. And on one version of it, you have like the phenomenal property of my pain is made up by these micro-phenomenal properties, which are distinct from pain, but somehow form pain. Mm-hmm. So you can't know that from an introspection.
No, that's a good point.
But that's an essential feature of the experience as well. And
very good point.
Yeah. But he, so I brought this up with him and said, well, why isn't revelation in tension with that part of the view?
Right.
And his answer is, oh, because it just tells you what it's like for you to have your pain, not like what it's. So you can still sort of know that it's experiential in its nature, that it's intrinsically experiential, even if you don't know like what the intrinsic micro qualities are.
Yeah.
So it seems like he has to accept that there's some essential properties that we don't have access to introspectively, while maintaining that there is some property that we do have revelation with respect to, and that's just what it's like for me to have the pain.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you about this. I think it's, I mean, revelation seems to me to be, whatever else you say about panpsychism, it looks as if it's inconsistent with revelation.
Right.
So that can be true, even if you don't like panpsychism or revelation, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
So, because if revelation were true, you would have to know that your experience was made up of these micro experiences.
Right.
If it was, and you don't know that, just as you don't know if materialism is true, that it's made up of, cells and things.
Exactly.
So that's right. So that's a bit of a problem for people like Philip, who like both revelation and panpsychism.
Yeah.
I've read his book and read it quite carefully, actually. Not the recent book, the one just before.
Consciousness and fundamental reality, that one.
Yeah, right. And I must say that it's elusive to me what he ultimately wants to believe about this. I mean, I think ultimately what he wants to do is hold a kind of panpsychism, which the kind of panpsychism that seems to me to be quite interesting is one that's structurally like a kind of physicalist view.
Right.
And one can discuss whether it's true or false, or whether it helps, or whether it faces exactly the kinds of problems that traditional materialism already faces, in which case there'd be no point being a panpsychist, because it doesn't really help you.
Exactly. That's what I think.
Yeah, so that's me too. So I'm sort of sympathetic with that. But I think that I'm not sure, but I think that the kind of panpsychism that he wants to defend ultimately is one which says that there's a sort of panpsychist. It's sort of structurally speaking like a traditional dualist view. It's just that in place of the physical side of things, you've got the physical side of things plus all these micro experiences.
Right.
And then the macro experiences bear some sort of contingent connection only to that.
Right.
And that's the sort of position. And that's true. That position isn't refuted by a kind of revelationist view. But
so
I mean, at that point, even his panpsychist friends, I think, would be backing away, because because that as I said, that the interest of panpsychism is that it's supposed to be a position which is structurally, in fact, in some versions, structurally equivalent to physicalism.
Right.
Whereas the kind of position he is interested in is structurally equivalent to traditional dualism.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. So, switching from Philip to your view here. So, would it be wrong to characterize the kind of Russellian monism? I know you call it Hegelian monism at one point, but would it be wrong to
6 different things?
Yeah, exactly. Would it be wrong to say that your view is like these views, but the intrinsic nature stuff is just not mental? It's some physical property which we can't understand or grasp at this point. Or are there more differences than that between the kind of panpsychism? So I know you don't like the word proto-panpsychism or whatever, but
pan-proto-psychism.
Yeah, that's it, pan-proto-psychism. And I think that's because, like, on those kind of views, what you get is a pan-qualityism. So that it's the mental qualities which are out there. But that already sounds kind of too mental for me. So I don't know. So what on your view is the commonality or difference between these kinds of view that you have in the Goff type view?
Yeah. So I tend to like a kind of a view that says that what I basically like is a kind of an ignorance-based response to the conceivability argument. So it says, look, we're ignorant of some relevant kind of physical fact. And if that is true, then depending on how you understand conceivability reasoning, either the conceivability claim isn't true, or the step from conceivability to possibility doesn't work.
Right.
Okay, and there are various ways of implementing that idea that we're ignorant of a certain relevant kind of physical fact. Russellian monism provides you with one particular implementation of that idea. I think it's an interesting implementation. I don't think it's required that you implement it that way. And I think that there are some issues that arise if you do implement it that way. But I do think it's an interesting way to implement it. And now, I think on that version, that kind of Russellian monist version that I like, what Dave calls pan-proto-psychists, or I tend to think of it as a kind of physicalist kind. I mean, Barbara Montero calls it Russellian physicalism, which is quite a good title, actually. I think one reason to think of that as of a completely genuine kind of materialism is to go back to certain kinds of people whose positions we kind of very naturally think of as kind of materialist positions, like Lewis and Armstrong and people like that, and Smart, actually, at certain points. Now, they actually all thought in different ways that, especially Armstrong, thought that physics characterized things dispositionally or in terms of relations. He went along with that idea. But he also thought that the dispositions that physics talked about had certain kinds of what he thought of as categorical grounds, properties. So if an object has a disposition, then it has some other property in virtue of which it has that disposition.
Right.
Okay, so he went along with all of those ideas, which have now been incorporated into Russellian monism. But of course, he didn't defend them in terms of Russellian monism. But now you've got to ask, well, what did he think was the status of those categorical properties that physics didn't exactly tell us about? Well, that creates a bit of a problem for him, because either he thinks of them as physical too, perhaps in an extended sense, or he thinks of them as non-physical. Now, if he thinks of them as non-physical, then he can't possibly be a physicalist.
Right.
And the reason is because take some possible world that's like the best case scenario for materialism. Like all there is in this world is an atom. That's all there is. There are no tables, and there are no spirits, and there are no colors, and there's just this atom. Okay. Is materialism true in this world? You ask. Well, whatever materialism is, it's got to look at that world and say, yes, I'm true in that world. Okay?
Yeah, better, yes.
Okay, now, but if you think, well, this atom is solid, solidity is a disposition. It's the disposition to resist penetration from other objects or something. Well, that means it must be grounded in something. So it must have some other property, this single object in this world. That's what Armstrong would say. Now the question is, what's the nature of that other property? Is it physical or not? Well, if he says it's not physical, then even this paradigm case of what materialism, this sort of best case scenario for materialism, will turn out that materialism isn't true. So if you sort of have that set of ideas and you think that the categorical grounds aren't physical, then you can't be a physicalist in the first place.
Right.
Okay. In fact, I think there's a famous book called A History of Materialism by Friedrich Lange, written in the 1860s. It's about how materialism changed over time and so on. And a lot of those people were not materialists, and I think they were not materialists because they were influenced by that line of argument or some version of that line of argument that I just gave you. Anyway, I think in Armstrong's case, he thought, that must mean that we have a notion of the physical that applies to the categorical base in addition to the disposition. And that seems plausible because otherwise he couldn't possibly be a physicalist.
Right.
Okay, so that means that he's got a notion of the physical that applies to the categorical base. Now, the Russellian monist position that I had in mind basically accepts that entire picture that Armstrong sets out, but just says, there's this further feature, which is that the categorical bases are relevant to the nature of consciousness. That is, the dispositions on their own don't ground consciousness. You need dispositions plus the categorical base. And that's completely, you can make that, one can debate whether that point is plausible or not, of course. But the only point I'm making at the moment is that you can formulate that completely within the set of ideas that Armstrong was operating with.
Right.
And so you haven't moved away at all from any of the physicalism, any of the kind of materialist, physicalist kind of ideas that he had. So that's the sense in which that's a kind of physicalism it's as much a physicalism as he was, because it says very little else than what he's already said. It's just that he, of course, wouldn't dream of thinking that the categorical bases were relevant to conscious states.
Right.
At least not ultimately. But that's kind of open to you to say that if you want to.
So the similarities then are very straightforward. So whereas for like on the panpsychist view, where you agree is that there's got to be some categorical basis for these dispositions. You both agree that those categorical bases are relevant to consciousness.
Yeah.
The disagreement is that for the panpsychist, these things are fundamentally phenomenal, mental, whereas for you, they're not.
On this.
On this picture,
or at least on that picture, which I have, as it were, discussed sympathetically. I wouldn't quite say for me, because
okay. Well, on that picture that you're sympathetic to, now, you're not even sympathetic to it. You've discussed it sympathetically. one step back. So, I guess
no, exactly. No, I like that view. So that's right. So that's exactly that's the difference.
Yeah, but then I guess and I guess it's part of the view that we just can't say much more about what those properties are, except for that they're categorical in nature, they're relevant to consciousness, but we can't.
That's right.
Can we say they're not structural or functional, right? Because they're categorical, or
depending on how you articulate those notions, yes.
Yeah.
There are legitimate ways of articulating those notions, according to which you could certainly say that they're not structural or functional. Yeah.
Okay, but are there ways of doing it where you could say that they are?
Well, as sort of came up a bit in our previous discussion, the notion of structure is so hard to keep track of.
Right.
I don't doubt that there's some notion according to which, for example, there's one notion of structure which is completely okay and is quite common, which just means relational.
Yeah.
If you talk about the structure of a table or something, you mean fundamentally the relation among the parts of a table. And so
there will be that kind of structure.
If you're saying to me, could they be two-place properties, in other words, relations? Yes, the answer would be yes. So by that standard, they would be structural.
Are you committed to an ideal entailability here? Is there something from these categorical properties plus dispositional features of those properties to phenomenal properties? Or even if we knew those things per what's actually the case, would we still be blocked? Is ignorance permanent, even for ideal reasoners?
Well, those are all slightly different questions, I think.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to go on with an ideal reasoner? So it's hard to say on this kind of view. One of the reasons that this kind of view I think is attractive to people, apart from the idea that. Sorry, let me go back a bit. If you were talking before about the contrast between this kind of view and a panpsychist view,
right?
A panpsychist, the view that I like says, yeah, there are these categorical properties. They're relevant to consciousness, but beyond that, we don't know what their natures are. Although, of course, we can say, for the reasons I mentioned, that they are physical in some broader sense of physical. And it's because we can't say what they are that we have a way of dealing with the conceivability argument.
Right.
The panpsychist goes on to describe what they are. The panpsychist says they're phenomenal properties of a piece with our own phenomenal properties. They just happen to attach to micro things, not macro things. And so we know what they are. And that's exactly what lands them in the combination problem.
Right.
which is kind of analogous in many ways to the conceivability argument. So the positions that we're talking about are sort of structurally similar, but they make rather different assumptions about what those categorical properties are. And as I've mentioned, the version of these positions that seems to me to be most attractive are ones which say we can say a few things about those categorical properties. They're not mental. We don't know what they are. They're physical in a natural sense. And that combination permits us to deal with the conceivability argument. But if we move away from any of that, then we don't say we don't have that available to us. Now, on the question of, whether an ideal reasoner would know about those things, whether there's a priori entailment. I mean, sometimes the whole notion of a priori entailment is a bit puzzling because the connection between it and conceivability reasoning is a bit puzzling. As I say, sometimes as we were talking about before, sometimes conceivability is just defined in terms of failure of a priori entailment or something.
Right.
But at other times it's formulated in terms of imaginability, and for that the connection to a priori entailment is much harder to articulate. So,
I guess the reason I was asking
those questions are open.
Well, because it seems like I was wondering why you couldn't run a conceivability argument on this kind of Russellian physicalism or Hegelian monism or whatever. So why couldn't you? Why isn't it conceivable that you have those properties and yet no consciousness?
Well, it's not conceivable in the imaginability sense. You can't imagine these things because you don't know what they are.
You can't positively conceive it, but you can do it in the negative sense, right? That doesn't.
Yeah, but as I said to you before, the negative sense isn't the one that's of interest for me. It's the positive one.
So isn't there the risk though that? I mean, it seems like there could be the risk that then what you're conceiving is basically the panpsychist version, but you just don't know it.
You mean it could be the panpsychist version?
Yeah.
Panpsychism could be true, but we don't know.
Well, if you can't say anything about these properties, then you don't really know, as you just pointed out, you don't really know what you're imagining when you imagine a world with those properties.
Well, you can't. I don't think you can.
So they might be not physical. Even contra.
Well, you see, it's sort of like, let's see if I can give you an example. I mean, it's sort of like, suppose I hold up a book and I say, it's possible that everything in this book is true, so it's possible that you know everything in this book, and you don't know that Charlie Chaplin died in Switzerland.
Okay.
So I hold up a book, and I say it's possible for you to know everything in this book and not know that Charlie Chaplin died in Switzerland. Okay, that's like a knowledge argument. It's possible for you to know all of this and not know that. Now, is what I said true or not? Is that possibility claim true or not? It's possible for you to know everything in this book and not know that Charlie Chaplin died in Switzerland.
It depends on what this picks out.
You can't say because you don't know what's in the book.
Exactly.
Right? Suppose it was a book. Suppose it was a biography of Charlie Chaplin that focused on his death in Switzerland. Well, then presumably what I said is false.
Right.
But if it was a Japanese cookbook, then presumably what I said was true. So the thing is that you can't assert a claim like that since you don't know what's in the book. Okay, so if someone said to you, it's possible to know everything in this book and not know that Charlie Chaplin died in Switzerland, you should reject that.
Right.
Right. Okay, well, I think the book of nature is kind of like the book I just held up. That is, we don't know what's in it exactly. So therefore, you can't say it's possible to know all of the facts or all of the physical facts and not know that certain facts about consciousness or something like that. It's because we don't know some of these facts.
So why isn't that itself an argument?
That's the basic idea.
And I get that that's the basic idea, but why isn't that itself an argument that positive conceivability is sort of the wrong thing to focus on? So we can't do positive conceivability for a reason just gave. But negative conceivability we can still do. We can still check for whether there's contradictions and tails.
But how would negative conceivability help with that example? I mean, I think that positive. The reason that I think imaginability is important is because it's the thing that gives you it's the most powerful way of establishing these modal claims.
Right.
And the thing about imaginability is that it has all these epistemic presuppositions. And if those aren't met, which I don't think they're met, then we can't use this kind of reasoning to establish these claims.
Right. Right. So, and I agree with that, but I'm wondering what's wrong with the negative conceivability stuff. Why isn't that? So that's what we were talking about before. Why isn't that? It's weaker. I grant that. But why isn't it good for adjudicating these kinds of cases? I mean, as Dave says, all you need is negative conceivability for the conceivability arguments proper to go through. You say, well, positive is better, but given that, we're sort of blocked off by your own.
I guess I'm a little worried. Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good question. I think I'm a little worried that negative conceivability won't establish these contingent connections of the kind that we're looking for. I mean, the traditional dualist is trying to say that there's only a contingent connection between the physical facts and the phenomenal facts. That's the whole point. Whereas failures of a priori entailment, for the reasons that many people point out, don't seem to establish contingent connections of that kind.
Yeah.
So it just seems a bit weak. That's why. And a lot of these, a lot of the arguments that seem very powerful and the ones that I accept seem to involve positive imaginability, or positive conceivability, or imaginability, or something. Mm-hmm. And so I guess that's the reason. I mean, I think, and as I was saying before, it's not as if I think there aren't historically important versions of these arguments that attack positions which aren't like contemporary materialism exactly, but they're certainly first cousins of it, or related theories at any rate. So I think it's that I'm. That's the reason.
I mean, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, we're running out of time here, and I can't keep you forever, so I guess I'll have to put a pin in that, and maybe someday I'll have you, if you have interest, you can come back, because there's still a bunch of stuff we're not even going to get a chance to talk about.
Happy to.
But I did want to talk about illusionism a little bit before we had to call it quits for today, and it's related to some of these issues that we've been talking about, especially with respect to introspection and what it delivers, and things about revelation and that nature. So you have a whole section on this as well. Excuse me, in your series of lectures, and possibly in this book that you're working on, which I'm looking forward to coming out someday, on introspection. And so
me too.
Yeah, I bet it's a lot of work. It seems, and that's a whole, maybe when it is closer to coming out, we can come and just talk about your positive view on introspection, because the whole idea of the rationalist view, I think, is very interesting, and there's some things I want to ask about it. But anyway. So with respect to illusionism, so you want to reject the claim that illusionists make, I think, which is that there's a notion of something in this vicinity which is important, that we learn about by introspection, but which we shouldn't think is there. So it seems to me like you want to reject almost every part of that package of claims that they have. Is that an accurate way of putting your view about illusionism, or not?
Let's think. So illusionism, I guess illusionism actually seems to me to be a somewhat shifting target. I mean, sometimes it seems to be the bold claim that if you believe in introspection that you're in pain, then your belief is false and you're not in pain. Sometimes it's the much less bold claim that, the sense datum theory of pain isn't true. That is, it's not the case that we're a queen. Okay, now it's so very, very hard for me to keep track of what's going on. Mostly what seems to me is that initially it was the claim that yeah, we're just not in pain. It was a kind of eliminativism about pain, together with this interesting claim about introspection, which is that we have this illusion that we have an introspective illusion that we're in pain, but we're not in pain. That was
Right.
the sort of interesting position. But often under pressure, it seems to be the view that we're only not in pain according to some specific theory of what it is to be in pain. And that theory looks, as I mentioned, suspiciously like the sense datum theory.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Or the classic qualia that Dennett wants to coin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So some kind of view which many of us have already moved beyond. So it's not perhaps as exciting as it seemed. Anyway, but setting that aside, I guess I took it that the illusionist wants to say three things, really. One is that there's some sort of psychological property which we believe to be instantiated in introspection, which isn't instantiated, so that we have some sort of false belief in introspection. And that moreover, that property has to play some very important role in mind-body-ish kinds of issues.
Right.
So those are sort of three conditions that's the three claims that the illusionist wants to make. So there is some property which, A, we believe in introspection is instantiated, B, is not instantiated, and C, is at issue in, for example, the knowledge argument against materialism. Right. And if those three things aren't met, then we don't really have illusionism of an interesting kind, because if you don't have the idea that we don't believe in introspection, or somehow we don't have an introspective representation or something, that the thing is instantiated, then we don't have the inner illusion. Mm-hmm. And it has to be an illusion, which means the thing is not instantiated.
Right.
And it has to play the role, it has to be implicated somehow in these arguments that constitute the mind-body problem. Otherwise, it's, I guess, what Frankish calls weak illusionism rather than the real thing, which
and
because
everybody, yeah,
everybody's a weak illusionist. Okay,
yes,
so
exactly.
That's why you need that. And so then, I mean, at least one criticism of illusionism is that there isn't such a property. So we could use just the examples that we were using. So take being in pain. Being in pain is presumably a property that does in fact play some role in a version of the knowledge argument. You could run the knowledge argument with being in pain. Is it the case that, do we believe in introspection that we're in pain? Yeah, we do. Whatever introspection amounts to, presumably we believe in introspection that we're in pain, at least sometimes.
Yes.
And but then the question is, are we in pain or not? Now, as I said, the kind of classic illusionist, as I understood it, wanted to deny that. But often they don't want to say that. They want to say, no, we are in pain, so that's all right. So that isn't the relevant, just the ordinary property of being in pain. That doesn't seem to meet these conditions. What about a sort of highly theoretical property like, being acquainted with a sense datum?
Yeah.
Let's say. Well, that I'm willing to go. As I said, I don't believe the sense datum theory, so I'm quite happy to think that property isn't instantiated.
Right.
I don't think it's that plausible that we represent ourselves in introspection as instantiating that property. I tend to think in introspection, there's an issue in introspection rather like the issue in perception, which is what the contents of perceptions are, like whether they're, what the admissible contents of perception is. So likewise, you could ask what the admissible contents of introspection is. Right. And I tend to think that at least initially, there's a sort of a relatively thin range of propositions that you come to know. You come to know things like, I am in pain. I don't think I come to know things in introspection like I instantiate a sense datum, or I am acquainted with a sense datum, even if that happened to be true. I don't think we come to know that by introspection. That was partly the point against revelation that we mentioned before.
Right.
And so that if you did come to know that, you'd have to come to know it by inference from something. So first you'd know that you're in pain, and then you'd have some theory available to you that said, pains consist in being acquainted with a sense datum. And then you put that theory together with the fact that you're in pain, and you derive the idea that you're acquainted with the sensitive. That sort of makes sense to me. You could say, if you like, that you come to know that by introspection, but really what's going on is that you come to know some first thing by introspection, and then you have some theory and you derive the fact that you are instantiated with that. That you are acquainted with the sense state, that you instantiate that sense state and property. And then the question is, well, how does that property go with respect to the three features I mentioned? Well, it does not instantiate it, so that's good. Is it? Do we believe in introspection that it's instantiated? Well, as I said, I actually don't think that's true. Though I can imagine somebody arguing that even given the picture I just sketched, somehow or other maybe Lewis is right, or he doesn't say that about the sense datum theory, but you can imagine not Lewis, but some position a bit like him saying the sense datum theory is kind of built into folk psychology.
Right.
Francois Cameron, I think, says things a bit like that, actually.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking to him soon, hopefully, actually.
Right, cool. He's really good to talk to. But so you might say, well, maybe by this extended sense of introspection, I come to know by introspection that I come to know or believe, let's say, by introspection, that I instantiate this sense data property. Now the question is that property crucial in the knowledge argument? To which I think the answer is no. I don't think the knowledge argument requires that you have this sort of highfalutin account of what being in pain consists in. I think the interesting thing about the knowledge argument is that it just operates with these simple notions like being in pain. So that's kind of the problem, I think, for illusionism, that there just isn't a property that plays the relevant role for them.
Right. So, and I like this diagnosis, but I wonder if we could, if we pushed a little bit on this, what you might say to the following kind of claim. So suppose that what they thought, which I go back and forth on this as well, I tell you, because I talked to Keith a few times. I've read a lot of his stuff. Obviously, I'm interested in this debate, but it's hard to pin down exactly what they're saying. But ultimately, I think their considered view is that that obviously pains exist, but that we characterize them in a strange way. And we characterize them in a strange way because of the way we come about to know them via introspection, that we represent them in introspection as having properties that they don't have. And so your argument is, everyone agrees with that. It's what the real question is, what kind of properties do we represent them as having? And are they the ones that matter for these traditional ways of thinking about these problems and the mind-body problem, conceivability arguments and so forth? So, and I like your argument, the answer is no. But so what if they say, well, look, what we're interested in is that there's this way of thinking about phenomenal properties, or whatever you want to call them, which is that by definition, they are not functionalizable or intentional or representational. And in the 90s, Ned introduced things in this way, by phenomenal properties, Ned says in the 90s, that simply those parts of experience which are not representational, functional, or intentional. And so that there's a way of thinking about ordinary pains as in those terms, which they think is illusionary and maybe something that we learn from introspection. Do you disagree with that? Or do you think that, in other words, that introspection delivers a verdict on whether these properties are representational, or do they appear non-representational or intentional or whatever? So is that a separate, do you see what the issue that I'm trying to raise here is, and whether you think that's merely weak illusionism, or is that a version of strong illusionism as well?
There's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah, sorry. We're running out of time, so I'm throwing everything out at once.
No, that's all right. I hate to say this to you, I tend to get a little bit worried about notions of functionalism, just in the same way I get worried about notions of structure. So when people say that they're functionalist, or that things aren't functionally analyzable or something, I always worry about what the relevant terms are that they are referring to. Okay. If it's a very limited range, then that's quite plausible. But if you're very relaxed about the range, then it's very much harder to nail down what it is to be a functional property.
I see.
On the issue of representation, it's an interesting question whether representation is introspectively accessible.
Right.
I mean, it depends a bit on what counts as introspectively accessible. Like, for example, as I said before, I think that we know by introspection that, I think I know by introspection that I have a pain in my foot. Suppose I have a pain in my foot, and I can come to know by introspection that I have a pain in my foot. Now, do I know by introspection that that is, as it were, essentially a representational state? Suppose it is. I tend to think no, for the similar reasons that we've gone through with the sense datum theory. It could be that I had a theory about what my being in pain consists in, according to which it's a representational state. And if I have that theory available to me, I could infer that it has that I'm in some representational state. And in that case, maybe I would go along with that it's in fact a true theory. But it's not clear to me that it's, as it were, in introspection, at least in what sometimes is called unaided introspection, the beginning sort of range of things that you come to know. And it's a bit like in perception, where you say, there's this discussion in perception about whether you can know that one thing causes another in perception, or whether in perception causation gets represented. Okay. Now, people say, yeah, you can. Causation is perceptible. You can perceive it. But even if you believe that, you wouldn't think that some sort of analysis of causation is sort of somehow present in perception. At least I don't think that's that plausible. You can't tell in perception that, humanism or anti-humanism is true about causation.
Right, exactly. Right.
Maybe perception tells you that this thing causes that thing, but it doesn't tell you about the nature of the causal relation. And likewise, I'd want to say, in introspection, we can perhaps know that we're in pain. In fact, I think one can. But the exact nature of what it is to be in pain, like whether it's a representational thing or not, that's a further claim.
So you disagree with
there's actually quite a lot of inference going on. So the inferentialist about introspection thinks that its inferences all over the place. In fact, there's nothing that isn't inferential. And I don't think that's true, because I think one can come to know that you're in pain in some non-inferential way. But I do think that claims about the nature of pain, like whether it's representational or not, at least very typically, are inferential.
Right. Yeah, because I think that the way I think about this is, I think that what the illusionist is really trying to get at is that there's some way of characterizing our experience, basically in very similar ways that revelation characterizes it. That there's, that in introspection, we're sort of come to know the essence of the thing. Or, and I know that's difficult. We've been through all that, but I think that that's the notion which the illusionist is trying to target and say, well, whatever led you to believe that there's something like that, that's a mistake, characterized. And so that take that as the fundamental lesson of illusionism, is that the way we characterize the thing we're after matters for what kind of explanation we're going to give to it. So to me, it seems like a debate over like what kind of concept we want to deploy in our science or theories of consciousness, and whether we want to have it.
Lewis had a view a bit like that. He thought that, as we said before, revelation is built into folk psychology, so that the conception of pain, for example, that is faithful to folk psychology will include revelation. But he also thought that revelation was inconsistent with materialism, and materialism is true. So therefore, in a certain sense, there are no pains. But then he said, there are alternative conceptions of pain that we can deploy at that point. And people like David Braddon Mitchell and Bob Stoljar and John Hawthorne hold these conditional analyses of pain, which actually function rather like this.
Right.
So there's some notion that has something like revelation built into it. Yeah, right. And if you build that into it, then there's no such thing as pain, but there's this other thing. I take it actually that the point we were talking about before, that illusionists start off by saying, you're not in pain. It just seems to you in introspection that you are. And then they, as far as I can see, typically withdraw
Walk it back
and make the claim that, by pain, I meant something quite loaded. and that's the thing that you're not in. Okay. So
And then I think
that means their position is rather like that Lewis position or the conditional analysis people.
And I take that as right, actually. And then what they think is that, this is kind of widespread. But so there's a question about whether you need that notion of consciousness to get the mind-body problem underway. And I don't think that you do. I think that's what we were talking about before, and what the discussion about revelation and all that sort of stuff kind of brings out is, I do sort of have a question about whether revelation gets snuck in at a certain place in the conceivability argument, specifically in the claim that the primary and secondary intention of words like pain and so forth kind of coincide. So there, I wonder if something is being snuck in. But besides that technical point, I think that really all you need is that there are ordinary experiences. That's what the conceivability arguments really take off with. And then, of course, you can theorize about them and build them up into this meatier notion. But I think that's really all you need, is that there is something we're picking out when we say there's a pain, and you don't need to build much more into it than that, which I think is something that the illusionists want to resist. They think that, if you just have the ordinary notion of pain, you don't get any grip on, that we're all turning to Dennett and think that, Mary can know everything in the room. I don't think that's really accurate as far as the way people tend to think about these issues. But I don't know. I think that's a separate issue, though.
Of course, they partly think that, but they also have this element of their view, which is that it's a kind of inevitable, sort of stable, introspective illusion. Which in a way is the most interesting aspect of the view. It's sort of, that plays the role for them that the notion of being built into folk psychology played for Lewis.
Right.
So I mean, I guess Dennett, when he talks about this kind of thing, gives the impression that it's a kind of, philosophers have invented this bizarre notion of pain or something.
Right.
To create jobs for themselves or something.
Exactly.
Not terribly successfully, perhaps you might add, but anyway, given the employment crisis. But anyway,
exactly.
but that's one traditional idea, that it's a kind of philosophical invention or philosophical confusion. And the contemporary illusionists, and I guess Lewis too, are not saying that. They're saying, no, it's built into ordinary thought. It's got nothing to do with it's not a philosophical imposition on thought. It's just built in some ways into ordinary thought. And so that makes it kind of interesting from just an empirical psychological point of view as to whether that's true,
Right.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. As we said, in the case of Lewis, the evidence base is a bit slim.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, I see we're out of time now. I wish we could continue this discussion, but I have my morning classes I got to get to, and it's probably evening in your time over there.
Yes.
So I do have to let you go. I'm hoping you will come back, because I didn't get to talk to you about all the stuff I've been saying about higher order theories or your own views about introspection and all that stuff. So we'll have to schedule a second discussion for that stuff. But let me take this chance to thank you for this really great discussion. I appreciate your time. And hang around for a second. I'll say bye off the air.
Thanks so much, Richard. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So we are free. We're off now.